In the lesson preview, you learned about Robert Smalls. But what happened to him after the war? Well, in addition to learning how to read and write, opening a school, and owning and operating a newspaper, Smalls was also elected to government positions at the state and federal level. How is this possible? The simple answer is Reconstruction, the period following the Civil War when the United States reintegrated the Confederate States into the Union. For Reconstruction supporters, reunifying the nation required tackling inequality. To achieve this, Congress passed the Reconstruction Amendments, or the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. In this lesson, we'll examine these amendments to answer our guiding questions. What did the Reconstruction Amendments change? How are the Reconstruction Amendments related to citizenship and immigration? And what factors affected how the Reconstruction Amendments were applied and enforced? We'll also tackle the essential question, to what extent did the Reconstruction Amendments affect equal access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Let's get into it. Basically, the Reconstruction Amendments expanded protections for non-citizens and increased access to citizenship. What does that mean? To answer that, we'll examine the Reconstruction Amendments together. Then you'll answer the first two guiding questions in your lesson PDF. What did the 13th Amendment change? First, it abolished slavery and established that formerly enslaved people were people, not property, opening the door for formerly enslaved people to become citizens. It also ended involuntary servitude, or forced labor, which usually took the form of debt peonage. This is when someone is forced to work to pay off debt, which could take years or even decades. So how does this connect to immigration? Well, in exchange for covering immigration costs, immigrants would sign contracts to work for free. Consequently, many immigrants arrived already in debt. Many employers took advantage of this system by adding new expenses to keep workers in debt. Abolishing involuntary servitude expanded protections for non-citizens by ensuring that all people could profit from their labor and control their own lives. What did the 14th Amendment change? As you learned, it increased access to citizenship by establishing birthright citizenship. It also gave naturalized citizens the same rights as US-born citizens. The 14th Amendment also created the Due Process Clause, which prohibits any person from being deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This guarantees several rights and protections when someone faces legal action, like the right to a fair trial. Additionally, it created the Equal Protection Clause, which establishes that all people are equal under the law. These clauses protect citizens and non-citizens because they use the word people instead of citizens. Why does that matter? To answer that, let's look at the Supreme Court case Yick Wo v. Hopkins. In 1880, the city of San Francisco, California passed a law requiring a special permit for laundromats operating in wooden buildings. That's oddly specific, right? Well, at the time, almost 90% of the city's laundromat workers and 66% of laundromat owners were of Chinese descent. And where are those laundromats located? In wooden buildings. 99%. Or all but one of 80 non-Chinese applicants received a permit. But only 0.05%, or 1 of 200 Chinese applicants, received a permit. Li Yick, a Chinese immigrant who owned and operated a laundromat, was denied a permit. After he refused to shut his business down, he was imprisoned. Yick sued, alleging the law violated the 14th Amendment. He argued that, even as a non-citizen, he was still entitled to equal protection of the laws. The case ended up before the Supreme Court, which determined the law did violate the Equal Protection Clause because it had been enforced in a discriminatory manner. The ruling was significant because it reaffirmed that the 14th Amendment protects non-citizens and prohibits unequal treatment based on race. What did the 15th Amendment change? It established that the right to vote cannot be denied to any citizen based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This resulted in the election of the first black representatives. During Reconstruction, 14 black men were elected to Congress, including 8 who had been previously enslaved. Thousands more were elected to local and state government positions. Pause here to complete the activity for the first 2 guiding questions in your lesson PDF. Next, we'll tackle our third guiding question by looking at factors that influenced how the Reconstruction Amendments were applied and enforced. You can pause as you need to take notes in your PDF when you see the light bulb icon, or just wait to complete the notes at the end of the section. But first, a quick content warning. The next section will include historical terms, events, and concepts that may be distressing for some people. Our goal is not to sensationalize or glorify these events, but to promote critical thinking and a deeper understanding of American history. Have you ever heard the question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one can hear it, does it make a sound? Well, if the Reconstruction Amendments aren't enforced, do their protections still exist? In 1877, federal support for Reconstruction ended. This meant that the federal government chose not to enforce laws and protections created during Reconstruction, allowing state and local authorities to undermine the progress that had been made. For example, local governments, particularly in the South, enacted Jim Crow laws. Also known as Black Codes, these were local and state laws designed to maintain white supremacy and the social, economic, and political subjugation of black people. Pause here to read some examples of Jim Crow laws in your PDF now. Didn't these laws violate the 14th Amendment? Well, yeah. But without federal enforcement, little could be done to stop these laws. Consequently, Jim Crow laws persisted until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Eventually, in a 1968 opinion, the Supreme Court admitted that the Black Codes were substitutes for the slave system. Like Jim Crow laws, vagrancy laws were also enacted after the Civil War. Pause here to examine the examples in your PDF. Vagrancy laws effectively criminalized being poor and unemployed. And how are these offenders punished? With forced labor. But wasn't forced labor abolished by the 13th Amendment? Slavery and involuntary servitude were abolished by the 13th Amendment, but it made an exception for people convicted of crimes. In other words, unpaid and forced labor was, and still is, constitutional for people convicted of crimes. And if you take that exception and add in vagrancy laws and Jim Crow laws, what do you get? A system that allowed forced labor to continue. As you know, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, supporters of eugenics wanted to prevent so-called inferior people from immigrating. Some, like Dr. Albert Priddy, wanted to prevent individuals with mental deficiencies from having children. Mental deficiencies is an outdated term that referred to a wide range of physical and mental illnesses, disabilities, and behaviors. Consequently, some states allowed for the sterilization of mentally deficient people without their consent. Sterilization is a medical procedure that prevents someone from being able to have children. Didn't that violate the 14th Amendment? To answer that, let's examine the Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell. At age 17, Carrie Buck was institutionalized for being mentally deficient because she had given birth while unmarried. While institutionalized, doctors, under Dr. Priddy's supervision, sterilized Carrie without her consent. A lawsuit was filed claiming the state violated Carrie's 14th Amendment rights. The case reached the Supreme Court, which determined that the forced sterilization of mentally deficient people did not violate the 14th Amendment because it protected society by preventing undesirable reproduction. This decision declared that people deemed mentally deficient were not entitled to the same 14th Amendment protections as the rest of the population. Forced sterilization laws became more common following Buck v. Bell. They disproportionately affected people of color, especially Black and Indigenous women. Pause here to complete the chart in your lesson PDF. Ultimately, laws and Supreme Court cases don't create equality. Social expectations, norms, and attitudes are just as important, if not more so. All Americans have a civic responsibility to uphold the principles of the Constitution, which includes ensuring that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are fairly and faithfully applied. You'll explore what that means in the next lesson. Until next time, keep making history.